has no name, and it's also quite unique from any other Doctor Who monster that we've ever seen. Today, I'm going to do a deep dive into what fans have dubbed the Midnight Entity. To begin, I'll do a brief recap of the encounters we've had with the entity so far. Then I'll compare and contrast the entity's behaviors and attributes between the two. And I'll highlight some of the evolutions that have occurred and why I think they have, and then I'll go into my own theories about how this creature behaves, its biological makeup, and more. As a disclaimer, I'm well aware that for most people the best part about the Midnight Entity is how much mystery surrounds it. So you might be thinking, why do we need to do a deep dive into it and try and figure out so many of these things? Well, I'm nosy, I'm autistic, and I'm gonna get into it. So if it's not for you, it's not for you. But let's get started. In the 10th episode of the 4th season of the 2005 revival, God, that's long, in Midnight, okay, a mysterious entity breaks its way onto a tour cruiser headed towards the Diamond Falls on the planet Midnight. The Doctor is joined on the tour by a family of 3, a professor and his assistant, and a lonely woman named Sky. A hostess, whose name remains unknown, is also with them. After breaking into the vehicle, the entity possesses Sky and begins to mimic the words and voices of the passengers. Over time, it learns and targets the Doctor as its next victim. Using Sky as a host body, it manipulates the paranoia of the other passengers to encourage them to throw the Doctor out, where he would be killed instantly by the planet's extonic atmosphere. This plan is thwarted by the hostess, who sacrifices herself to pull the entity out of the vehicle. Imagine if I sat here and seriously said the full, in the 3rd episode of Series 15/Series 41/ blah 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 of Doctor Who. No. So in the well, the Doctor and Belinda join a platoon of troops who have been called to investigate a mining facility on planet 6767, previously known as Midnight. Almost everyone there has either been shot or viciously physically assaulted. There's only one survivor, Alice Fenley. It is revealed that something is behind Alice, and whomever goes behind this entity is violently killed. Alice states that the entity latches on to whomever kills its host. Many of the troops are killed testing this theory or attempting to engage with the entity. Eventually, the Doctor frees Alice from the entity using reflective liquid mercury. However, it is not destroyed. It latches on to Belinda and potentially Shia and Mo. Both Belinda and the Doctor have seen the entity. The way in which the Midnight Entity behaves, and also just exists, is drastically different between these two episodes, so let's compare and contrast. To briefly talk about the planet, in the episode Midnight, the entire planet is said to be covered in diamonds. In the well, the diamond, which is called Carbon-46 by Shea, has been stripped from the surface of 6767 during war times. Diamonds still exist below the surface, however, and are mined for. When it comes to the entity's approach, in the episode Midnight, it's first seen roaming above the surface. However, in the well, the entity emerged from below the surface, and it was described as coming out of the well laughing. When it's first seen in Midnight, it's simply seen as a shadow by one of the drivers of the tour bus. In the well, however, we actually see a lot more of the Midnight Entity. It's first seen by Belinda in a more physical form behind Alice. It's later observed in a presumably still physical form by both the Doctor and Belinda. In Midnight, the entity demonstrates immense physical strength by being able to tear off the cabin of the tour bus and shake the entire structure. However, physical strength is not demonstrated while possessing Sky or the Doctor. Similarly, in the well, immense physical strength is still demonstrated. The entity... Are you dead? Hello? Oh no. In the well, the entity still demonstrates immense physical strength, able to toss people great distances and break most of their body. In the episode Midnight, the entity appears to attack the weakest of the pack first. This starts with Sky, who is traveling alone and very mentally vulnerable. Secondly, the Doctor, who is pushed away by the rest of the group. In the well, though, it's unknown who the entity started to attack first. According to Alice, it transfers to whomever killed its previous host. One of the main creepy factors of the episode Midnight is that the entity is focused on learning and copies, then eventually steals the words of the tour group. However, we don't see any of this in the well. Back to Midnight, the entity appears to possess a host and psychically control/possess others while inside of this host. However, in the well, the entity doesn't appear to possess a host body, but latch on and stayed behind it instead. It is implied, however, that the entity wasn't able to possess or control or perhaps kill Alice because she couldn't hear it. It's said in Midnight that the entity creeps into your head and whispers. Sky/the entity tells the other passengers to
listen. Listen. Just listen. Just listen.
At which point their mental distress increases and the attempt to throw the doctor out of the shuttle begins. Similarly, in The Well, the entity is once again described as whispering. This time, the whispering is audible to the audience and those whom the entity latches onto.
No.
It is possible, however, that it's just in the minds of those hearing it. You might recall that slowly but surely the entire tour group turns against the Doctor. Well, the entity appears to be able to possess or psychically affect multiple people at once. It is able to possess the Doctor from inside of Sky and makes the other passengers more aggressive. That last bit could be debated, but to me, it's very clear that that's what's happening because Sky tells the passengers to listen, and then one of them says, "Get him out of my head!" Yeah. So I think it's very clear that the entity is having some kind of psychic effect on the other passengers. James A. has a really good video about the Midnight Entity where he talks a bit more about the process that you can see the characters going through as they become more aggressive. On a more different note, in The Well, the entity initially seems to only latch onto one person and moves on to whomever kills that host. However, it is also possible that it's shown latched onto multiple people at a time, that being Alice, Belinda, and Mo. Alice does tell the Doctor that apparently everyone in the mining facility went mad and that, quote, it happened so fast. This to me implies that it's very possible that the entity did psychically affect or just in general affect the behaviors and the paranoia and the thoughts of everyone in that mining facility to cause chaos. Jamie on Twitter pointed out that in the background of the security footage, you can see two miners who appear to be fighting each other. Since Sky says in Midnight that the entity makes you fight, this supports the idea that it is influencing the miners on a mass scale before they are killed. According to The Well, if you are positioned at midnight behind the entity, you die at midnight. This isn't something that ever appears in Midnight, and I don't believe, on rewatching and analyzing it, I don't believe that positioning in relation to the host or the entity is ever a factor. Another thing that's very different from Midnight is that in Midnight, the entity does not show any vulnerability to reflection. However, I also didn't see any mirrors, so we can't necessarily confirm or deny that it wasn't vulnerable to reflections at this time. In The Well, though, the entity is assumed to be vulnerable to reflection. It destroys the mirrors in the mining base on 6767. However, the reflection cast by liquid mercury does not appear to actually destroy or harm it because we know that it survives. I'm just going to go through some really quick, easy theories about some of these changes. Firstly, I think there's a chance that it now uses such immense physical force to directly attack and kill people, because that is a learned behavior from the violence of the hostess throwing Sky out of the airlock. Like, it's probably just really mad that it got thrown out, and it's like, well, I'm gonna start throwing people. When it comes to why there was no mimicking or stealing people's voices, I personally feel that the entity probably learned all that it needed to in Midnight, so it didn't see a need to continue to do this. When it comes to the whole bit about the entity being actually behind someone, I thought this through. It is possible that the entity simply latched onto Alice as it could not complete a full possession. However, it is also possible that the entity did exist in some physical form inside of the tour bus during the first encounter, as the door to the shuttle was open, though Sky was possessed before this. It is possible that the entity physically latched onto Sky at some point, but simply wasn't visible. To me, therefore, it's unclear whether or not standing behind someone and physically being present is a changed or learned behavior. Now, let's get into some of the more complex and hypothetical theories I have about the Midnight Entity. I did try and limit the amount of theories that contradict each other, but there is bound to still be some contradictions. These also are definitely not airtight theories, nor are they meant to be. This is simply me putting together some thoughts that I have about this entity based on the few pieces of information that we have of it. She demands to be pet. She demands it. My first theory about the Midnight Entity is that it has a biological perception filter, or something similar to it. Another disclaimer, I'm well aware that perception filters are usually in the form of technology and are placed on people or objects intentionally. However, I am proposing that there may be a similar biological ability like those of chameleons that the entity could be using. This is probably one of my favorite theories that I've compiled for this video, and I think it might be the most plausible for many reasons. Firstly, not everybody can see the entity. At midnight, it's only seen by one of the crew. In the well, it's only seen by Belinda, the doctor, and it's implied to also be seen by a couple other troops. Assuming that the entity was physically present in some form during midnight, which I do believe because it had a physical impact on the bus, and the doctor didn't see it then, but does see it now in the well, it is unlikely that the entity is simply seen due to the doctor having heightened telepathic abilities, or him and Belinda having heightened awareness of typical tricky tech due to being space-time travelers. Therefore, I hypothesize that the entity is seen when it wants to be. Similarly, I also believe that it's only heard when it wants to be heard. Some evidence of this includes, firstly, the implication that the tour attendees hear it after Sky/the entity tells them to, quote, listen. Secondly, in the well, the doctor can hear it after intentionally reaching out to speak to it. Later on, Belinda can hear it, presumably when she's already listening out for it because the group is trying to figure out who is infected with it. Not just on a biological standpoint, I do think that this theory fits really well with how the midnight entity behaves. It would likely choose when to reveal itself as a means of increasing fear/paranoia. Alice was not going to reveal its presence, so it may have wanted to restart the panic by revealing its image to the team. Belinda is vulnerable due to being in a new environment with unfamiliar medical tools, not having humans/the Earth be recognized, and is the outsider in the room, hence why it might have chosen to reveal itself to her first. Another big part of this theory for me is the sub-theory of why the mirrors were destroyed. You might recall that in the 11th Doctor episode, The Vampires of Venice, the perception filter used by the vampires does not work in a mirror. If the entity has some sort of biological perception filter or something that follows the same sort of rules as that, then being seen in a mirror could impact whether or not it's seen when it wants to be. This could account for why the midnight entity destroyed all of the mirrors in the mining base and why the Mercury didn't destroy it, because, well, maybe the doctor just read into it wrong. Being seen outside of the limit of what the entity controls what you see could expose more of its form and thus potentially vulnerabilities. And, if everybody's seeing it, then you have less to work with in the terms of paranoia. Every good theory or argument has a counter-argument that you have to address and work with. For this theory, it's the fact that in the Vampires of Venice, the mirror simply doesn't reflect the vampires. The response to this is that the mirror doesn't reflect the vampires because the mind couldn't comprehend two conflicting images, according to the episode. However, there would be no different image to contradict the one reflected in these mirrors because the entity would be hiding its entire self, not giving off an alternative appearance like the vampires were attempting to. More on the point of the Mercury not actually having an effect on the entity, a lot of people have pointed out that the surface of midnight used to be covered in diamonds, which are highly reflective. And they are highly reflective, but they also refract light a lot. So in my mind, it may have been easy for the entity to hide amongst the diamond landscape, as the diamonds may have obscured its image. Now, on to my theory about the clock face rule that we see in the well. According to the well, the entity kills whomever is stood directly behind its host. The entity did not always follow this rule, at least from what I saw. For a brief moment, those behind Alice are not harmed. Presuming Shia did have the entity, then there is a moment where the doctor stands behind her and also wasn't harmed. Maybe it does have to be like a very, very exact angle, but I just don't feel that the entity truly followed this rule 100% of the time. But when it comes to the entity's behavior and its attitude, the doctor describes the entity as playing games and having fun. Furthermore, the script of Midnight describes Sky as acting like a child. I hypothesize that the clock face rule is nothing more than a game invented by the Midnight entity. It may have been inspired by human concepts of midnight or clocks and time that it learned from the Doctor or Sky. and connected it to the planet's name, maybe it's just a little creative. It's a little silly. Linking this theory back to the psychic control that the entity appears to have over people, I think it's very possible that it may have influenced the troopers and maybe even Cassio himself into following Cassio's irrational plans as a means of feeding them to its slaughter. Some people have pointed out to me that you need another person involved, standing in front of the host, for the entity to attack the person behind it. But if that's true, then it just reinforces to me that this is a game the entity is playing, because I can't wrap my head around any biological or evolutionary path that would have led to that. I've also seen some point out how the entity appears to be throwing its victims at Cassio to get him to move more and gain more victims. So again, this looks to me like something is playing its own game and dragging others into it. This next theory is a bit more of a reach, but I have a theory about what the Midnight Entity might be made of. Let's recap a little of what we know about the planet Midnight. The planet was once covered in diamond, and diamonds continue to be mined below the surface. Diamonds are almost entirely comprised of carbon atoms, and Shia refers to diamond as carbon-46. The professor's presentation in Midnight shows that the majority of the planet is made up of diamond. Therefore, carbon is heavily present on this planet. The majority of the chemical composition of this planet and the landscape and potentially the entity appears to be carbon related. Just like diamond, graphite is a form of carbon. And in my opinion, based off the very, very quick and obscured sightings that we have of the Midnight Entity, its appearance is a little similar to what graphite can look like. The image that I include in my presentation is a pretty good example, but as another one, graphite is also used in pencils, which have this sort of smooth black surface that I feel is also similar to what the Midnight Entity looks like. I hypothesize that the body of the Midnight Entity is made of a graphite-like substance, or another carbon-based substance, but I'm sticking with graphite. Stick with me. Said that no living thing can go out onto the surface of the planet Midnight because it is so poisonous, there's so much radiation, all of the extonic rays. So when it comes to graphite is good at resisting radiation, though it can still be affected by it. If the Midnight Entity is made of a similar material, this could explain how it can withstand the galvanic radiation on Midnight's surface. Graphite is formed in low pressure and low temperatures, and also takes a long time, which may be why it waited in the dark and cold. This may be where it spawned from. Pressure would, theoretically, if this planet is following similar planets, pressure would increase as you go further underground, and the entity winds up 5 miles deep at least in the well. However, graphite is able to withstand extreme pressure. There is a brief segment in the Doctor Who Unleashed episode for the well that shows one of the crew members using a fright mask to scare the actors and kind of get them in the mood to experience what the characters might be experiencing. If this mask is what the Midnight Entity looks like, then its skin has a bit more of a fleshy texture than I thought, but as I said, graphite can still be kind of smooth. It's not ever explicitly stated that this is what the Midnight Entity looks like or that it was filmed as part of the episode. And a lot of people that I've spoken to, and this is what I thought too, the general consensus is that it isn't the Midnight Entity, it wasn't filmed as part of the episode, it is just a stand-in prop to kind of set the mood. Like a visual reference for the actors to have, kind of like how they use dots for green screen creatures and things like that. I feel inclined to agree that this isn't what the Midnight Entity looks like, simply because from what we see in the episode, it's really hard to match up, especially with what we see at the end of the episode. What Belinda sees does look similar, but I had a hard time matching up the angles, because I'm assuming the Midnight Entity is looking at Belinda over Alice's shoulder, and it makes more sense to do a little like, ooh, peekaboo, than to be like turning to the side and going like, because that's the only angle that makes sense to me. Especially at the end of the episode, it didn't seem to match up. I definitely feel like I saw a mouth. It's very vague, but to me it kind of seems like this sock puppet, like going like this from a larger body. But I also saw like when it's brightened, it kind of does look like there might be like multiple Like multiple limbs or multiple creatures? Either way, I don't feel that the behind-the-scenes footage of this mask contradicts my theory. I know I said before that the biological perception filter theory was one of the more plausible ones. Well, I think this next theory is the most plausible one, which is that there is multiple of the Midnight Entity, or it can split. The majority of my evidence and reasoning for this comes from the well. The airlock door near the end of the episode implies that the entity is still attached to Alice, as the screen recognizes 4 beings rather than the 3 that we see. There is a jolt, and the Doctor, Belinda, Mo, and Shea realize it is still among them. Eventually, it's implied that the entity is still with Mo. There is a non-zero possibility that there is now more than one of the entity, and both Alice and Mo are hosts simultaneously. We already know that it can possess and influence multiple people at once. This could totally just be widespread psychic control, or alternatively, the entity may be able to split itself into separate parts, which are sentient and can live and infest on their own, but may still follow a hive mind. It could infest a brain using a piece of itself, and that piece could grow over time to consume the new host and eventually operate separately. When possessed, the Doctor starts as Sky/the entity does, by repeating and then catching up, even though the original entity is still inside Sky. Even the Doctor suggests that the next stage could be the entity becoming us.
Repeats, then it synchronizes, then it goes on to the next stage, and that's exactly what the Doctor said would happen.
A counter argument that I have for this theory is that if the Midnight Entity can split, wants to spread, why would it try to kill the Doctor in Midnight? The response I've rationalized for this is that it might have just been for fun and games. But on a more serious note, it may have wanted to devolve the passengers more quickly, and the Doctor was the one who theorized the most about how it worked, thus making some of them still question Sky once she's been freed. So it might have just wanted to get rid of the Doctor. That would get an obstacle out of the way and make it way easier for it to overtake the other passengers, which does seem to start to happen as they're trying to throw him out. As a means of backing up this theory, I want to compare the Midnight Entity to another Doctor Who monster, the Shalka. Just to clarify, I am not saying that I think the Midnight Entity is Shalka or is extremely similar to them, though they are similar. I am just using those similarities to demonstrate my point. Shalka comes from the Flash animation episode Scream of the Shalka, featuring the Shalka Doctor, played by Richard E. Grant. These monsters use sound in the form of screams to control humans. They also lived under the earth and invaded planets via meteorite. So how does this relate to the Midnight Entity? Well, we know that the entity whispers to its victims to make you fight and get into your head. This last bit is not as important, but just to tie it back into my theory about what the entity is made out of, graphite does often come from meteorites. But the main thing I want to point out to demonstrate a potential similarity is that the Shalka can merge together to form what's referred to as the Shalka conglomerate. Could the Midnight Entity perhaps operate on a similar level, beginning as a conglomerate and then splitting off as it infests more people? Sort of like tapeworms. Scream of the Shalka do actually sort of spread and infest people by kind of like implanting a Shalka into their head. This happens to Allison, the companion of the story. If I'm remembering correctly, at one point the vibe is that this only happens to a few people, and those people kind of like are the hub of a group of possessed humans. So it is possible that the host only infests a handful of hosts, such as Alice and Mo, and then plans to use those hosts to simply influence or psychically control groups of people without splitting into all of them. On to the challenge of this theory, which is similar to the challenge to my last one. If the goal of the entity is to spread, it doesn't make much sense for it to kill all of the minors rather than slowly infect them, unless it is at the point where it doesn't need to learn from them and simply seeks to latch onto their bodies, but it doesn't appear to do this. My thoughts on this is that each potential host may have just been killed too quickly for the entity to properly take hold of them, and it likely prefers the warmth of live bodies. though some have interpreted Sky as being dead the moment possession begins. As an alternative, it could simply just be all the same creature under a hive mind without the ability to grow or exist separately. Another challenge that I just realized as I'm editing is that if there was a piece growing inside of the Doctor, why did it suddenly stop or detach when the host was thrown out of the Airbus? My thoughts on this are that it's possible that it might need to still be attached to the host or somehow linked to the host for a time before it can exist on its own, and Sky might have been thrown out before that point was reached, meaning that the piece that was inside of the Doctor just kind of died. Not enough evidence to fully confirm it either way, though I do feel that the well heavily implies, to the point of confirming, that there is multiples of this entity in some way, shape, or form. Again, I keep adding stuff, sorry, but a lot of people have theorized that when the Doctor did the trick with the mercury to reflect the image of the entity, it actually refracted it, and that is when it might have split into multiple beings. I think that this is a pretty valid theory. Obviously, nothing is confirmed, and it's always up to interpretation. I do think some challenges to that are the fact that it doesn't seem to leave Alice, because it's still on her, so I can't see it detaching and then reattaching as quickly as it would have had to. And also I do definitely think that in Midnight there is something growing or developing inside of the Doctor, so, you know, in some way, shape, or form there might have been a multiple. But it is an interesting theory that the Doctor might have accidentally cloned or duplicated the entity, and now more of it can infest. Nick also theorizes that reflections didn't harm the entity, but duplicated it, and it actually might have been the mining crew that smashed the mirrors, and that was why. For this next theory, I have to give a huge shout out to the YouTuber James A, who has his own great video analyzing the Midnight Entity, because this next theory is a continuation of one of his, and that is the theory that the entity is able to control people via the electric signals in their brain. James theorized that the entity was an energy-based parasite and may have occupied the electrical signals in Sky's brain to control her. Electrical signals and impulses travel through the brain and impact our emotions, behavior, thoughts, etc. They're even involved in processing sound, sight, and other stimuli. This could potentially explain how the entity would be able to influence people's behaviors, as well as what it looks like or sounds like to them, or whether they don't see or hear it. Which ties into my earlier theory about there potentially being some kind of biological characteristic or innate behavior that operates similar to a perception filter. Perception filter. Let's follow James's thread about the entity being a parasite. Plenty of real-world parasites affect the behavior of its host. A parasite that inspired the infection in The Last of Us, for example, primarily infests ants and changes their behavior before killing them. Most of these parasites seek to spread and use their victims as a means of carrying this mission out. In the well, the Doctor says, and this could just be his opinion, that the goal of the creature is to get out. It's likely that it wants to escape so that it can spread, and this could be why it's attached to both Alice and Mo, who might be going to different places. Because then you have two different infection pools starting. Circling back to electrical signals being one way that the entity might control people, graphite is also a good conductor of electricity. Now, I don't have the scientific knowledge to more formally link that together. I just saw that it was a good conductor of electricity and said, hey, I have a theory about electricity. Something else that gives more weight to the theory that electrical signals are how the entity controls people is that it would likely be much easier to overpower a Time Lord's brain through manipulating their neurons and the brain's electric impulses, which is a more physical approach, rather than overpowering them cyclically. So it is more terrifying if you consider the latter happening. When it comes to this theory, I do think that it's way scarier if you imagine that it is simply a completely otherworldly psychic level of control that we can't even fathom. But it is cool to think that there might be some real-world science behind how the entity works. I just thought that this was a really cool theory and wanted to develop it a bit more. So again, shout out to James. He has a great video and I highly encourage you to watch it. Many people have theorized that Alice was dead the whole time, and is similar to Sky in that she has been completely taken over. Some evidence for this includes her mentioning that she wants to go home constantly, the fact that her helmet light is not on at the end of the episode while the other soldiers are, which could indicate that it's not active or circulating oxygen for a living being. Furthermore, she is the only survivor and thus could be the only one able to mess with the video footage. As the only survivor, she also controls the narrative about what happened, which means she could have invented the clock face rule or game if she wanted to. Her wounds are also still fresh after 2 weeks, which could indicate that the body is not healing like a living one would, or that she smashed the mirrors. At Numdies on Twitter also points out that she is perfectly positioned in the middle of the room and a circle, which ends up fitting in perfectly to the mythos of the clock face game. I feel that this theory is very plausible, though it would contradict the idea that one has to hear the entity to be taken over. It does, however, match what I said earlier about there being a central host that later infects or controls the others, whether to drive them to death or to find another central host. Mo might be that secondary central host, whereas the others were just being influenced and didn't have a piece of the entity growing into another inside of them. I would like to note that I do also have issues with this theory because I don't like the idea of the disabled character secretly being a villain all along or deceiving the other characters, especially considering the episode tackles how disabled people and sign language can be seen as suspicious and how that's wrong. Regardless of what theories you believe about the Midnight Entity, or how you interpret each episode, one thing is very clear. It does have evil intent, and it does have fun psychologically torturing its victims as well as slaughtering them. In closing, The Well gave us a second chance to analyze one of Doctor Who's most mysterious and terrifying monsters. It shows us that this creature has clearly evolved or changed across 400,000 years and defies our expectations as a result. I had a great time making this video and analyzing the entity, although there is so much mystery left and so many questions that I will never have the answers to, and I hope I don't. Again, this was very fun, and The Well, in my opinion, does work as a sequel. However, a lot of the time, less is more, and I do hope that we don't see the Midnight Entity in the future. Not because I'm scared of it, or anything, okay? I am scared of it, but isn't it terrifying to think that it might be infecting multiple people in multiple different places and spreading, and that will just go unchecked and unrealized? What do you think about my theories? Do you think some of them might be plausible, or do you think I sound like a total bingus? You can be honest, but either way, thank you for watching. If you want to see more from me, please subscribe to my YouTube channel or follow me on social media. I hope you're staying safe, happy, and healthy. I hope you're having a great day, night, whatever time it is for you, and goodbye.